am your host, Miss Marple. Welcome to my channel, Sherlock Midnight Echo. Remember...
The rain had stopped at precisely 11 minutes past 3. Whodunits. This was the sort of detail that nobody in the village of Little Wexford would normally have remembered. Yet, by the following morning, nearly everyone would remember it perfectly. They would remember the rain tapping against the glass roof of the parish hall. They would remember the smell of wet roses drifting in through the open windows. They would remember the silver urns of tea, the plates of cucumber sandwiches, and the little tables crowded with homemade cakes. Most of all, they would remember the recipe cards. The annual Little Wexford Summer Fete had always been a modest affair. There were no brass bands, no grand celebrities, and certainly no scandals, at least none that were supposed to be discussed aloud. There was a tombola beneath the oak tree, a white-painted stall selling preserves, and a baking competition judged by 3 local ladies who had been feuding politely over sponge cakes for 12 years. This year, the baking competition was to be held in the parish hall because of the weather. At 4 o'clock, the winner would be announced. At 4:15, someone would be dead. And at 4:20, Miss Jane Marple would quietly notice something nobody else had thought worth noticing. At first, everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Mrs. Edith Bellamy stood behind the tea table, supervising the pouring of tea with the authority of a naval commander. "Not too much milk, Mr. Pritchard," she said sharply. "I haven't put any milk in yet." "Exactly. I was warning you." At the opposite end of the room, Clara Finch was arranging the entries for the baking competition. There were 12 cakes, a lemon drizzle, a Victoria sponge, 2 fruitcakes, a chocolate gâteau, 3 varieties of tart, and a magnificent honey cake decorated with sugared violets. The honey cake belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Vane. Everyone knew that. Everyone also knew that Mrs. Vane had won the competition for the past 4 years. 5 years, if you count the wartime one, whispered Mrs. Bellamy. "Everyone counts the wartime one," replied Reverend Hawthorne. "Not everyone." The voice came from behind them. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. She was sitting near the window with her knitting folded neatly in her lap. Her pale blue cardigan looked entirely unsuited to the damp summer afternoon, but Miss Marple had never been greatly concerned with fashion. She had come to Little Wexford for a fortnight to stay with an old school friend. Unfortunately, her friend had developed a cold. Fortunately, the village fete had developed into something considerably more interesting. Miss Marple looked toward the honey cake. 5 years is a long time, she observed. Mrs. Bellamy sniffed. "It is, indeed." There was something in the tone that made Reverend Hawthorne glance at her. Miss Marple merely smiled. She had learned long ago that people rarely told you what they were thinking. They usually told you what they wanted you to think. Across the hall, Eleanor Vane was laughing. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, with silver blonde hair and a manner that suggested she had never been obliged to doubt herself. Beside her stood her niece, Lydia Vane. Lydia was 27 and looked nothing like her aunt. Where Eleanor was polished and confident, Lydia was quiet and watchful. "You've forgotten the cards," Lydia murmured. "What cards?" "The recipe cards." Eleanor's smile vanished for half a second. Then it returned. "Oh, those. They were on the kitchen table." "Then they are still on the kitchen table. I thought you wanted them beside the cakes." "I said I wanted the cakes beside the cards." Lydia looked confused. Eleanor leaned closer. "Darling, please don't fuss." Miss Marple noticed this exchange. She did not look directly at them. She continued knitting. A minute later, Lydia crossed the room. She returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside were 12 handwritten recipe cards. Each card had been prepared for the competition entries, giving the ingredients and method. The cards were placed beside the cakes. One card, however, was different. It had a faint brown stain across one corner. Lydia noticed it. She frowned. "That's odd." "What is?" asked Clara Finch. "This one." She held up the card belonging to Eleanor's honey cake. Clara examined it. "It looks like tea. It wasn't there this morning." Then someone spilled something. Lydia turned toward her aunt. Eleanor was speaking to a man near the doorway. His name was Charles Vane, her estranged husband. He had not been expected at the fete. That, more than the stained card, caught Miss Marple's attention. Charles Vane was a quiet man, with a reddish face and an uncomfortable habit of looking at the floor when people spoke to him. He and Eleanor had separated 11 years earlier. Nobody in Little Wexford knew exactly why. Naturally, everybody had a theory. Miss Marple had heard 3 of them before lunch. By tea time, she had heard 7. At 3:30, Eleanor raised her glass. "To old friends," she said. There was polite applause. Charles Vane did not clap. Neither did Lydia. At 4 o'clock, the judges began tasting the cakes. The honey cake was first. Eleanor watched anxiously. For the first time that afternoon, she looked uncertain. Then Mrs. Bellamy took a bite. She swallowed. She smiled. "Well," she said, "that is quite extraordinary." Eleanor exhaled. The tension seemed to leave her shoulders. But before she could speak, Mrs. Bellamy's expression changed. Her hand went to her throat. The teacup slipped from her fingers. It struck the table and shattered. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Bellamy collapsed. The hall erupted. Someone screamed. Someone shouted for a doctor. Reverend Hawthorne pushed through the crowd. Lydia stood frozen beside the cake table. Eleanor Vane stared at the fallen judge, and Charles Vane whispered something nobody understood. Miss Marple remained seated. Her eyes were not on Mrs. Bellamy. They were on the recipe card. The brown stain had spread, very slowly, across the handwritten ingredients. Miss Marple leaned forward. The card had been lying beneath the honey cake, yet the stain was not underneath the cake. It was on the upper corner, and there was something else, a tiny thumbprint, not on the stained portion, beside it. Miss Marple looked across the room. 3 people were watching the card: Lydia Vane, Charles Vane, and Eleanor Vane. Only one of them looked frightened. Miss Marple lowered her eyes to her knitting. "How very curious," she murmured. Nobody heard her. That was just as well. Outside, the church clock began to strike 4, and in Little Wexford the summer fete was over. The murder investigation had begun. Section 2. The village has a theory. By 4:30, the parish hall had become a place of whispered voices. Outside, the rain whispered against the windows. Nobody seemed quite willing to leave. Every face had acquired the expression of people who had suddenly discovered that tragedy could be more entertaining than a summer fete, provided it happened to somebody else. She had not died. That was the first piece of news. The second was that she was unconscious. The third, delivered by Inspector Vale at precisely 20 minutes to 5, was that the honey cake had been removed from the table and would be examined. This produced an extraordinary silence. Then everyone began talking at once. It must have been the cake. Of course it was the cake. She ate nothing else, except the sandwiches. She didn't eat a sandwich. Are you certain? I saw her. Miss Marple listened. She had moved to a chair beside the window. Her knitting rested in her lap, though she had not added a stitch for several minutes. Inspector Vale noticed her. Miss Marple? Yes? You're staying at Rose Cottage, aren't you? I am. You were sitting here when it happened? Yes. Did you see anyone touch the recipe card? Miss Marple looked toward the table. No, that was not quite true. She had seen Lydia touch it. She had seen Eleanor touch it. And she had seen Charles Vane pick up a napkin beside it. But she had not seen anyone touch the stained portion. There was a difference. Very well, said Vale. He turned away. Miss Marple watched him approach Eleanor Vane. The woman had been sitting alone near the fireplace. I need to ask you a few questions. Of course. You prepared the honey cake? Yes. When? This morning. Where? At home. Did anyone help you? No. Did anyone have access to your kitchen? Eleanor hesitated. My niece, Lydia. And your husband? Eleanor's face tightened. Charles does not live with me, but he was at the fete. Yes. Did you invite him? No. Do you know why he came? No. Inspector Vale looked at her. Eleanor met his gaze. I suppose you think he poisoned the cake. I haven't said that. You don't need to. Across the room, Charles Vane heard his name. He stood abruptly. I didn't touch the cake. Nobody had accused him. His statement, therefore, sounded very much like an accusation against himself. A murmur passed through the room. Mrs. Finch whispered. Well, that settles it. It does not, whispered Reverend Hawthorne. Why not? Because nobody has established that the poison was in the cake. Mrs. Finch stared at him. What else could it be? The recipe card, said a quiet voice. Everyone turned. Miss Marple looked mildly surprised that she had spoken aloud. Inspector Vale approached her. The recipe card. Yes. You think the card was poisoned? No, Inspector. Then what do you mean? Miss Marple glanced at the table. I merely wondered whether everyone was assuming the poison had been introduced through the cake. Vale studied her. You noticed something? I noticed several things. What things? Miss Marple smiled. I'm afraid I have a habit of noticing things that are probably unimportant. Try me. She looked toward Eleanor. The card was stained before Mrs. Bellamy collapsed. So the stain might tell us when something happened. Vale's expression changed. You're saying the poison was on the card? No. Then what are you saying? That I don't know. Meanwhile, the villagers had begun their own investigation. At the refreshment table, Mrs. Finch had gathered an audience. I always thought there was something strange about those veins. Mrs. Bellamy's cousin Agnes leaned closer. What sort of strange? Money. Agnes nodded knowingly. They were supposed to be wealthy. They are wealthy. Were. This distinction produced silence. Mrs. Finch continued. Charles Vane lost a great deal. How much? I don't know. Then how do you know he lost it? I know because my brother told me. Your brother died in 1989. Yes. Nobody pointed this out. In another corner, Lydia Vane stood alone. Miss Marple watched her. The young woman looked pale. She kept rubbing her thumb against the side of her index finger. Then Lydia noticed Miss Marple watching. She crossed the room. May I speak to you? Certainly, dear. Lydia sat beside her. My aunt didn't do it. Miss Marple looked at her. I didn't say she did. Why do you think someone will? Because everyone hates her. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. My aunt has enemies. Lydia lowered her voice. My aunt has enemies. This is different. Lydia hesitated. Then she whispered. She knows what happened 11 years ago. Miss Marple's knitting needles stopped. What happened 11 years ago? I don't know. But you said she knows. I said she knows what happened. I didn't say I know. Before Miss Marple could reply, Eleanor called sharply from across the room. Lydia. The girl stood. I have to go. She walked away. Miss Marple watched her. Then she looked at the evidence envelope containing the recipe card. There were stains that could be seen. There were stains that could not. And, she thought, there were secrets much the same. At 6 o'clock, Inspector Vale announced that Mrs. Bellamy had regained consciousness. She had spoken only 4 words. Eleanor gave it to me. The village heard the sentence within minutes. By 7 it had become, Eleanor poisoned her. By 8 it had become, Eleanor confessed. And by 9, little Wexford had decided that the mystery was solved. Miss Marple knew better. She had seen too many people mistake certainty for truth. That evening, as she walked back toward Rose Cottage, she paused beneath a dripping hawthorn tree. She remembered the stained recipe card, the brown mark, the thumbprint, and one small detail that nobody else had mentioned. Mrs. Bellamy had been holding the recipe card when she collapsed, but she had not been reading it. She had been smelling it. Miss Marple's expression became thoughtful. Oh dear, she said softly. Then she continued walking. Section 3. The Quiet Questions. By 9 o'clock the following morning, Little Wexford had divided itself into camps. There were those who believed Eleanor Vane guilty, those who believed Charles Vane guilty, and those who believed the police had no idea what they were doing. Mrs. Finch encountered her outside the village shop. Awful business, Mrs. Finch said. Very. Though I always suspected something. Miss Marple smiled. Did you? Of course. Eleanor Vane has never been trustworthy. What makes you say that? Mrs. Finch lowered her voice. Her first husband disappeared. Miss Marple blinked. Her first husband? Oh, not literally disappeared. He went to Canada. That is rather different. Nevertheless. Miss Marple smiled again and went into the shop. At the counter, the shopkeeper was speaking with Inspector Vale. The card came from Mrs. Vane's kitchen, Vale said. Did you find anything? Not yet. Miss Marple selected a tin of biscuits. The inspector noticed her. You seem remarkably cheerful. I find biscuits comforting. I'm beginning to think you're avoiding my questions. Not at all. He lowered his voice. Mrs. Bellamy says Eleanor handed her the cake. Did she? Yes. Then Mrs. Bellamy remembers it. Very clearly. Interesting. Vale frowned. What is? Nothing. That word again. Miss Marple paid for her biscuits. As she turned to leave, she noticed a small packet of flour on the shelf. She stopped. Is this the flour Mrs. Vine uses? The shopkeeper looked puzzled. Probably. Everyone buys that brand. Does everyone? Nearly. Miss Marple nodded. Outside, the church bell struck 10. At Rose Cottage, she found Lydia Vine waiting. I thought you might come, Miss Marple said. How did you know? I didn't. Lydia looked embarrassed. I need your help. Miss Marple placed the biscuits on the table. What sort of help? I want to know who poisoned Mrs. Bellamy. So do the police. The police think my uncle did it. And what do you think? I don't know. That is often a good beginning. Lydia sat down. My uncle and aunt hated each other. Did they? They've been separated for 11 years. Yes, but they don't hate each other. Miss Marple looked at her carefully. That is quite a distinction. Lydia swallowed. They pretend to. Why? I don't know. You seem to know a great many things you cannot explain. Lydia smiled sadly. My aunt is like that. Tell me about the recipe card. Lydia's expression changed. There was something strange about it. What? The handwriting. Miss Marple leaned forward. Whose handwriting? My aunt's. Was it hers? Yes, but the final line wasn't. What final line? The honey. Miss Marple waited. The recipe said 2 tablespoons, but Aunt Eleanor always uses 3. Are you certain? I've watched her make it for years. That was the first useful thing Lydia had said. Miss Marple asked. Who wrote the card? My aunt. And who altered the amount? I don't know. Could the alteration have been made recently? Yes, before the fete, I suppose. Lydia looked frightened. There is something else. Miss Marple waited. Yesterday morning I found Uncle Charles in the kitchen. What was he doing? Looking through the drawer. Which drawer? The one where Aunt Eleanor keeps her recipes. Miss Marple said nothing. Does that make him guilty? No. Lydia looked relieved. Then why are you smiling? Because, my dear, guilty people are not the only people who search through drawers. A knock sounded at the door. Inspector Vale entered. Miss Marple, I need a word. Lydia stood. I'll go. No, said Vale. Stay. He placed an evidence bag on the table. Inside was a scrap of paper. Found this in Charles Vane's coat pocket. Lydia stared. What is it? A copy of the recipe. Miss Marple examined it through the plastic. Where was the original? Still in evidence. Why did he have a copy? He says Eleanor gave it to him. Did she? We don't know. Miss Marple looked at Lydia. Did your aunt give Charles recipes? Never. Why not? They couldn't agree about anything. Not even honey cake? Especially honey cake. Inspector Vale sighed. Charles admits he was in Eleanor's kitchen. Why? He says he wanted to speak to her privately. About what? He won't say. Miss Marple's eyes remained on the paper. There was a crease across the center. A very clean crease. She asked. Inspector, was this paper folded? Yes. Before or after it was written? I don't know. Miss Marple nodded. Then perhaps we should find out. Vale looked irritated. I'm interested in poison, Miss Marple. So am I. I don't think paper folding will solve a murder. No, she smiled. But people sometimes fold paper when they are nervous. Lydia looked at the scrap. Uncle Charles always folds things. Miss Marple turned to her. Does he? Yes. Letters, newspapers, receipts, everything. Does your aunt? No. Miss Marple nodded. Then she noticed something else. The scrap of paper had a faint brown stain on one corner. Exactly like the recipe card. Her expression did not change, but inside, a small suspicion had begun to take shape. Not about Charles. Not yet, she asked Vale. Did you find any other stained papers? No. Then perhaps you should. Why? Because if one stain is accidental, it is an accident. She touched the evidence bag lightly. If there are two, it may be a habit. Vale stared at her. Miss Marple picked up her biscuits. Now, she said, I think I shall visit Mrs. Bellamy. And ask her what? Nothing important. Vale sighed. That is precisely what worries me. Miss Marple smiled. People are often most truthful when they believe they are discussing something unimportant. Outside, the village continued its ordinary morning. Milk bottles clinked. A bicycle rattled past. Someone opened a shop window. Little Wexford appeared peaceful again. But beneath that peacefulness, 3 people were already preparing lies, and Miss Marple had begun to wonder which one had been rehearsed longest. Section 4. The obvious suspect, Mrs. Bellamy was sitting upright when Miss Marple arrived at the cottage. She looked considerably better than she had the previous evening, although her face remained pale. A blanket covered her knees, and a cup of weak tea stood untouched beside her. I knew you would come, she said. Did you? You have the look of someone who asks questions. Miss Marple smiled. I hope I don't. Oh, you do. Mrs. Bellamy leaned closer. The police think Charles Vane poisoned me. So I understand. And I think they are right. Why? Because I saw him. Miss Marple waited. He was standing behind Eleanor when she handed me the cake. I remember him clearly. Did you see him touch the cake? No. Did you see him touch the plate? No. Then what did you see? Mrs. Bellamy frowned. He was watching. Watching what? Eleanor. Miss Marple stirred her tea. That is not quite the same thing. Mrs. Bellamy looked annoyed. You always defend people, don't you? Not at all. I simply dislike being unfair to them. Charles Vane has been unfair to Eleanor for years. Has he? Yes. Then perhaps you could tell me why. Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but Miss Marple noticed it. Everyone knows about their marriage, she continued. Everyone knows something. Mrs. Bellamy sighed. Charles wanted money. Eleanor had it. Then there was the business. What business? An inheritance. Miss Marple said nothing. The Vane family owned a company years ago. Charles was involved. Eleanor's father left most of the shares to Eleanor, not Charles. Why? That is the question. Did Charles believe he had been cheated? Apparently. And did he have a motive? He certainly had reason to hate her. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Did Charles ever threaten Eleanor? Not that I heard. Did he threaten you? Mrs. Bellamy looked surprised. Me? Yes. No. Then why do you think he poisoned you? Because I was judging Eleanor's cake. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That seems a rather indirect method of attacking someone. Mrs. Bellamy stared at her. What do you mean? If Charles wanted to harm Eleanor, why poison the judge? Mrs. Bellamy had no answer. Miss Marple rose. Thank you for your time. You haven't asked about the card? No. Why not? I wanted to hear what you remembered first. Mrs. Bellamy frowned. I smelled something strange. Yes, a bitter smell. What did you do? I looked at the recipe card. Why? I thought perhaps someone had spilled something on it. Did you touch the stain? No. Did you touch the card? Mrs. Bellamy hesitated. Yes. With which hand? My right. Miss Marple nodded. Thank you. One of the plants had been crushed. A shoe print was visible in the damp soil. It was not large, nor was it fresh. She straightened. Interesting. He admits everything except poisoning her, Vale said. What does he admit? Entering Eleanor's kitchen, taking the recipe, being at the fete without invitation. Why did he take the recipe? He says he wanted proof. Proof of what? That Eleanor had altered the family recipe. Miss Marple blinked. Altered it? Yes. Why should that matter? Vale looked embarrassed. I don't understand it either. What did Charles mean? He claims Eleanor changed the recipe deliberately. Miss Marple smiled. People can become surprisingly possessive about recipes. This one may have been valuable. How? It was connected to the Vane family's old confectionery business. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Ah, apparently their honey cakes were famous. And the recipe was considered a family secret. Then Charles taking a copy makes more sense. Vale nodded. But it still doesn't explain the poisoning. No, unless he used the recipe card. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. Did Charles know Mrs. Bellamy would be the judge? Yes. Did he know she would taste Eleanor's cake? Yes. Then he had opportunity. He had motive and access. Yes. Which makes him the obvious suspect. Vale smiled. Exactly. Miss Marple did not smile. That is usually when I become cautious. The news traveled through Little Wexford faster than the church bell, Mrs. Finch told the baker. By lunchtime, the village knew that Charles had confessed. He had not. By 2 o'clock, people knew he had been caught with poison. He had not. By 3, someone claimed he had admitted murdering Mrs. Bellamy. He had done nothing of the sort. That afternoon, she visited Eleanor Vane. Eleanor opened the door herself. You've come about Charles. Yes. He didn't do it. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. You sound certain. I am. Why? Eleanor looked away. Because Charles is many things, but he isn't a murderer. That is a strong statement. I know him. Perhaps better than you think. Eleanor stiffened. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing unpleasant. Everyone in this village thinks Charles wanted me dead. Do you think he did? No. Why? Eleanor's face became strangely tired. Because if Charles wanted revenge, he would have taken it 11 years ago. Miss Marple studied her. And what happened 11 years ago? Eleanor closed the door. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor said quietly, You should ask Lydia. Why? Because she knows more than she realizes. Miss Marple turned toward the road. At the gate, she stopped. Mrs. Vane. Yes. Who wrote the recipe card? Eleanor's expression changed. I did. Entirely? A pause. Yes. Miss Marple smiled. Thank you. She walked away. Miss Marple had learned that village certainty was a dangerous thing. Once a story was repeated often enough, people remembered the repetition as evidence. A lie did not need to be convincing at first. It only needed an audience willing to repeat it. And Miss Marple knew this well. Behind her, Eleanor remained in the doorway. She watched Miss Marple until the elderly woman disappeared around the corner. Only then did Eleanor close the door. In the quiet hallway, she opened a drawer. Inside lay an old photograph. 4 people stood beside a bakery window. Eleanor, Charles, a young Lydia, and another woman. Across the photograph, written in faded ink, were 5 words. The recipe was never yours. Eleanor turned the photograph face down. Then she began to cry. Section 5. The stain. The next morning began with sunshine, which Miss Marple considered rather unfortunate. Rain made people cautious. Sunshine encouraged them to believe that unpleasant things belonged to yesterday. By 8 o'clock, Little Wexford had returned to its ordinary habits. The baker opened his shutters. Children hurried toward school. Mrs. Finch purchased 3 newspapers despite claiming she disliked gossip. Inside was a second recipe card. Miss Marple examined it carefully. What is this? A duplicate. Whose? Eleanor Vane's. The card was older than the one recovered from the fete. Its edges were worn, and the handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's. Miss Marple read the ingredients. Honey, butter, flour, eggs, lemon, and, at the bottom, 3 tablespoons of honey. She looked up. 3. Yes. Yesterday's card said 2. Exactly. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Where did you find this? In a drawer beneath the kitchen dresser at Eleanor's house. Who discovered it? I did. Was anyone with you? Constable Reed. Did Eleanor know you were searching there? No. Miss Marple returned the card. So the original family recipe uses 3 tablespoons. That appears so. Then why did Eleanor tell Lydia that she had always used 3? Perhaps she was telling the truth. Miss Marple smiled. I rarely distrust people merely because they tell the truth. Vale frowned. Then why did she write 2 on the competition card? That is precisely the question. He produced a second envelope. There's more. There usually is. We found a bottle in Charles Vane's car. What was in it? Nothing dangerous. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. Then why mention it? Because it contained a strange brown residue. Have you identified it? No. Could it be honey? Yes. Then it may be nothing. That is what worries me. Miss Marple smiled. You are learning. Vale ignored this. We also found Charles's fingerprints on the bottle. Were they recent? We can't tell. Then they prove very little. I know. He leaned forward. But Charles admits taking the recipe. Why? He says he wanted to compare it with an old family version. Did he? Yes. Did the two versions differ? Only in the amount of honey. Miss Marple looked at him. Only. Vale sighed. I knew you'd notice. She returned the card to its envelope. What happened to Mrs. Bellamy? She is recovering. Has she changed her statement? No. She still says Eleanor gave her the poisoned cake. Yes. Does she say Eleanor poisoned it? No. That is important. Vale looked surprised. Why? Because everyone else says Mrs. Bellamy accused Eleanor. But she didn't. Exactly. The inspector sat silently for a moment. Then he said, There is another problem. Mrs. Bellamy's tea? No. Lydia Vane. What about her? She lied. Miss Marple looked up. About what? She said she never entered the kitchen after noon. And? A neighbor saw her there at 2:30. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Did the neighbor see her doing anything? No. Then perhaps Lydia's lie is less important than it sounds. Why would she lie? People lie about innocent things all the time. Why? To avoid embarrassment, to avoid questions, to protect someone. Vale studied her. You think she is protecting Eleanor? I think she is protecting someone. At 11, Miss Marple walked to the Vane house. Lydia answered the door. You shouldn't be here. That is an interesting greeting. I'm sorry. Never mind. Lydia stepped aside. Miss Marple entered. Your aunt is home. No. Where is she? She went to the solicitor. Miss Marple nodded. May I see the kitchen? Lydia hesitated. Why? I like kitchens. It was such a harmless answer that Lydia could not refuse. The kitchen was immaculate. Too immaculate, Miss Marple thought. There was no flour on the counter, no crumbs, no dirty cups, not even a tea towel out of place. She walked slowly toward the dresser. Miss Marple paused beside the window, where sunlight fell across the empty counter and made every spotless surface seem strangely deliberate indeed. Where did the old recipe card come from? Lydia pointed. That drawer. Miss Marple opened it. Empty. You said your aunt kept recipes here. She did. Where are they now? I don't know. Miss Marple noticed a small smear on the drawer handle. Brown. She touched nothing. Lydia? Yes? Who cleaned this kitchen yesterday? I did. All of it? Yes. Before or after the police arrived? Before. Miss Marple nodded. Why? I was frightened. Of what? Lydia's eyes filled with tears. I don't know. Miss Marple closed the drawer. Did you know Mrs. Bellamy would smell the card? No. Did you know the card was stained? Lydia looked at her. What stain? Miss Marple said nothing. The girl went pale. You knew about it, Miss Marple said gently. No. You reacted before I explained what I meant. I didn't. You did. Lydia lowered her head. I saw it. When? Before the cake was served. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because I thought it was tea. Was it? I don't know. Miss Marple watched her carefully. Who touched the card? Lydia whispered. Aunt Eleanor. Anyone else? I saw Uncle Charles near it. Did he touch it? I don't know. Lydia. The girl looked up. I saw someone touch it. Who? I can't tell you. Why? Because if I do, something terrible will happen. Miss Marple's expression softened. My dear, something terrible has already happened. Lydia began to cry. I promised. To whom? She shook her head. At that moment a door closed somewhere upstairs. Both women looked toward the ceiling. Lydia's face became white. Aunt Eleanor. No, she whispered. Miss Marple heard footsteps. slow, measured, coming down the stairs. She looked at Lydia. "Who else is in this house?" Lydia did not answer. The footsteps stopped outside the kitchen. The handle began to turn. Miss Marple's hand rested quietly upon her knitting bag. The door opened. Charles Vane stood there. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Charles looked at Lydia. "You shouldn't have brought her here." Miss Marple smiled. "I wasn't brought." Charles stared at her. "I came because I wanted to ask you about the recipe." His face changed, only slightly. But Miss Marple noticed. "Which recipe?" he asked. "The one with 3 tablespoons of honey." Charles said nothing. And in that silence, Miss Marple understood that the old recipe card was not merely a clue. It was a warning. Section 6, the things people hide. Charles Vane remained in the kitchen doorway, one hand resting against the frame. Miss Marple gestured toward a chair. "I don't think I should. People often say that when they have something important to say." Charles gave a short, humorless laugh. "You are rather direct, only when necessary." Lydia stood beside the dresser, twisting her fingers together. Charles looked at her. "You promised." "I know. You promised not to tell anyone." "I haven't." Miss Marple glanced between them. "That is interesting." Charles frowned. "What is?" "Nothing at all." Charles stared at her. "You're not going to ask me whether I poisoned Mrs. Bellamy?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I have already asked myself. And I don't think you did." His expression changed. "Why? You are angry with Eleanor." "Yes." "You wanted something from her." "Yes." "You went into her kitchen." "Yes." "You took the recipe." "Yes." "You were at the fete without being invited." "Yes." "And you had an opportunity to poison the cake." Charles looked at her. "Then why don't you think I did it?" "Because you have been trying too hard to look guilty." Lydia stared. Charles said nothing. "You wanted the police to believe you had a motive. You wanted Eleanor frightened. But you did not want Mrs. Bellamy dead." Charles lowered himself into the chair. "That woman always was too clever." "Which woman?" "Eleanor." "Ah." Charles rubbed his forehead. "She knew what I came for." "The recipe?" "The truth." Miss Marple waited. Charles looked toward Lydia. 11 years ago, Eleanor's father died. I know. He left the business to her. Not to you? Not to me. Why? Because he believed I had stolen from him." Lydia looked startled. "You never told me that." "I couldn't." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "Did you steal from him?" "No." "Then who did?" Charles looked at the floor. "Eleanor." The kitchen became very quiet. The silence seemed to deepen around them all. Lydia whispered, "No. She took money from the company," Charles said. "Not for herself. She was trying to save someone." "Who?" Charles shook his head. "That is the part she refuses to discuss." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And you have spent 11 years allowing everyone to believe you were responsible?" "I thought the truth would destroy Lydia." Miss Marple looked at the young woman. "Why?" "Because the person Eleanor protected was her father." Lydia stared at him. "That makes no sense." "It does when you know what happened." Charles stood. Eleanor's father had a gambling problem. He borrowed money from dangerous people. When the business began to collapse, Eleanor used company funds to pay his debts. "Without permission?" "Yes." "Then why did your father accuse you?" Charles laughed bitterly. "Because Eleanor convinced him I had done it." Lydia covered her mouth. "Why?" "Because she knew I would never defend myself." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Why wouldn't you?" Charles looked at Lydia. "Because your mother was dying." Lydia went still. "My mother?" Charles nodded. "She knew everything. She begged me not to expose Eleanor. Your mother believed the family would fall apart, but my mother died when I was 16. "I know. You could have told me." "I promised her I wouldn't." Miss Marple remained silent. There was no triumph in the revelation, only sadness. She asked, "What did you want from the recipe?" Charles reached inside his coat and produced an envelope. "This." He handed it to her. Inside was a letter. Miss Marple read it carefully. It was dated 11 years earlier. The handwriting belonged to Eleanor. The letter said that the family honey recipe had been used as a code. Every alteration represented a payment. 2 tablespoons meant £1,000, 3 meant 1,500. The recipe had been passed between Eleanor and someone who had helped her settle her father's debts. Miss Marple looked up. Who received these messages? I don't know. Then why steal the recipe? Because I found another copy yesterday. Where? In Eleanor's desk. Was it stained? Charles hesitated. Yes. Brown stain? Yes. Did you touch it? I picked it up. Did you taste anything? No. Did you notice a smell? Something bitter. Miss Marple nodded. Like Mrs. Bellamy. Charles stared. She smelled the card. Yes. I don't understand. Neither do I. Miss Marple looked toward Lydia. Yet, a sharp knock sounded at the front door. Lydia hurried away. Soon Inspector Vale entered. His expression was grim. Miss Marple, I need to speak with you. What has happened? Mrs. Bellamy has changed her statement. Charles went pale. What did she say? She says Eleanor did not give her the cake. Miss Marple looked at him. Who did? Vale answered quietly. Lydia Vane. The young woman returned to the kitchen. She stopped when she saw the inspector. No. Vale looked at her. Mrs. Bellamy says you placed the cake in front of her. I didn't. Then why did she say you did? I don't know. Miss Marple studied Lydia's face. The girl looked terrified, but fear was not guilt. Sometimes fear meant only that a person knew something terrible and had no idea how to explain it. Miss Marple turned to Vale. Did Mrs. Bellamy say anything else? Yes. What? She remembered the smell. Miss Marple waited. She said it was not on the cake. Silence followed. Charles slowly sat down. Lydia looked at Miss Marple. Then where was it? Miss Marple glanced toward the old recipe drawer. I think, she said softly, that is the question we should have asked yesterday. Before anyone could answer, the kitchen door opened. Eleanor Vane stood there. She looked at Charles, then at Lydia. Finally, she looked at Miss Marple. You've found it, she said. Miss Marple smiled. Found what? Eleanor's face crumpled. The reason they tried to kill Mrs. Bellamy. No one moved. And Miss Marple suddenly understood that the poison was only the beginning. Section 7, the second poisoning. Eleanor Vane did not enter the kitchen. She remained in the doorway, one hand gripping the edge of the frame, while Inspector Vale watched her with the careful expression of a man who had suddenly realized that his comfortable theory was collapsing. What do you mean? Vale asked. Eleanor looked at Miss Marple. You know. I know very little, said Miss Marple. That is why I ask questions. Eleanor gave a tired smile. You always were like that. We have only met twice. Twice is enough. Charles stood abruptly. Eleanor, tell them. She turned on him. You have told them enough. Not the important part. There is no important part. Miss Marple looked from one to the other. How very interesting. Vale sighed. Mrs. Vane, Mrs. Bellamy says the smell was not on the cake. She says it came from the recipe card. Eleanor closed her eyes. Yes. And you knew? Yes. Why? Because I put it there. Lydia gasped. Charles stared at her. You poisoned the card? No. Eleanor opened her eyes. I stained it. With what? Tea. Val looked confused. Why? To frighten someone. Miss Marple's expression remained calm. Whom? Eleanor did not answer. Miss Marple glanced at the recipe drawer. Someone who knew about the family code? Eleanor's face hardened. Yes. Who? Someone who has been threatening me for months. Charles stepped forward. You should have told me. I didn't want your help. You needed it. I needed Lydia protected. At her name, Lydia looked toward the window. Miss Marple noticed the movement. Protected from whom? Eleanor whispered a name. Marian Bell. The inspector frowned. Who is Marian Bell? Nobody answered immediately. Then Charles said, the woman who worked for the family. Worked where? In the bakery. Is she still alive? Yes. Where is she? Eleanor looked frightened. She left Little Wexford 11 years ago. Miss Marple remembered the photograph. 4 people beside a bakery window. Eleanor, Charles, Lydia, and another woman. Marian Bell, she said. Eleanor nodded. She knew about the money. What money? The money I used to pay my father's debts. And she helped you? No. She blackmailed me. Charles stared. You said she disappeared. I said she left. Why did she return? Eleanor looked at the floor. I don't know. A telephone rang upstairs. Everyone froze. The sound came again. Lydia ran toward the stairs. Miss Marple caught her arm. Wait. Why? Because whoever is calling may not want you to answer. The telephone rang a third time. Inspector Vale went upstairs. A moment later, he called down. No one is there. The ringing stopped. Then came a crash from the kitchen. They turned. The window had been broken. A small stone lay on the floor. Tied around it was a piece of paper. Vale picked it up. Miss Marple watched his face change. What does it say? He handed her the paper. 3 words were written across it. 3 tablespoons tomorrow. Eleanor began trembling. Charles swore beneath his breath. Lydia whispered, What does it mean? Miss Marple looked at the message. It means, she said quietly, that someone knows about the recipe. That night, the village was frightened. For the first time, nobody wanted to discuss the murder loudly. Curtains remained closed. Doors were locked. The baker sent his wife home early. At Rose Cottage, Miss Marple sat beside the fire. Inspector Vale stood near the mantel. We have a threat, he said. Yes. And a possible blackmailer. Yes. And a missing woman from 11 years ago. Yes. Yet you don't think Marian Bell poisoned Mrs. Bellamy? No. Why? Because Marian Bell would have no reason to make the mistake she made. What mistake? The message. Vale frowned. 3 tablespoons. Yes. What is wrong with it? Everything. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. The old recipe uses 3 tablespoons. The competition recipe used 2. Whoever wrote that message wanted us to believe 3 was dangerous. Vale stared. But why? Because they wanted us looking at the recipe, and not the person. Exactly. The inspector paced slowly. Then what should we look at? Miss Marple smiled. Who benefits when everyone is watching a piece of paper? Before Vale could answer, there was another knock. Lydia entered carrying a small parcel. This was left outside. Miss Marple looked at it. Did you touch it? No. Good. Vale opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph. The same photograph Miss Marple had seen at Eleanor's house. But someone had scratched out Eleanor's face. On the back, 4 words were written. One of you remembers. Lydia began to cry. Charles looked at Eleanor. Eleanor stared at the photograph. Miss Marple did not look at any of them. She looked instead at the parcel. There was no address, no stamp, no fingerprint. But there was a faint smell. Not poison. Honey. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. Then she smiled. The second warning had been designed to frighten them. The first had been designed to mislead them. And somewhere between those 2 intentions was the truth. She rose slowly. Inspector? Yes, I think we should visit the old bakery. Tonight? Tonight. Why? Miss Marple picked up her coat. Because if Marian Bell really returned to Little Wexford, someone must have seen her. And if nobody did? Then, said Miss Marple, we shall have learned something much more interesting. Outside, the village clock struck 11. At that exact moment, a light appeared in the window of the abandoned bakery. Miss Marple stopped walking. Vale stared. The light disappeared. Then a shadow crossed the glass. Someone was inside, and they were waiting. Miss Marple watched the dark window without moving. She did not call out, nor did she hurry forward. Whoever stood inside wanted to be noticed. That was the trouble. A trap was rarely dangerous because it was hidden. It was dangerous because it appeared to offer exactly what the frightened wished to find. And Miss Marple disliked convenient answers. Section 8. The Old Bakery. The abandoned bakery stood at the end of Church Lane, where the houses became fewer and the hedges taller. Yet someone had been inside. Inspector Vale unlocked the door with a key borrowed from the village council. Someone has been here recently, Vale said. Miss Marple looked around. How can you tell? There is no dust on the counter. He looked. A clean rectangle marked the counter where something had recently been placed. What was here? I don't know. Miss Marple examined the room. There were shelves, a broken oven, and a narrow staircase leading upstairs. Do you suppose Marion Bell lived here? Not according to the records. Records can be surprisingly incomplete. Vale opened a cupboard. Nothing. Another. Nothing. Then he found a tin box. Inside were old invoices, receipts, and several recipe cards. The handwriting was not Eleanor's, nor was it Charles. Marion's? Vale asked. I believe so. The card contained only ingredients. Flour, butter, honey, lemon, nothing unusual. Miss Marple turned it over. There was a tiny pencil mark, 3 dots. She looked at the other cards. One had 2 dots, another had 4, another had 1. Someone expected another person to understand it. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Vale reached for his torch. They climbed the stairs. The upper room was empty. On the table lay a fresh envelope. Vale picked it up. Inside was a photograph. Marion Bell stood beside Eleanor Vane. Both women were young. Between them was a child. Lydia. Miss Marple looked carefully. Look at Lydia's hand. Vale frowned. She is holding something. A key. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. There was writing beneath the photograph. Ask her who opened the safe. Vale turned toward the stairs. Who? Miss Marple was already descending. She had learned that the best questions were sometimes answered by watching people before they had time to prepare their faces. Eleanor. They returned to the Vane house before midnight. Eleanor was waiting in the drawing room. You found the bakery, she said. Yes. Then you found Marion. No. Eleanor closed her eyes. She was never there. Someone was. Yes. Who? I don't know. Miss Marple sat opposite her. Who opened the family safe? Eleanor looked at her sharply. Where did you hear that? At the bakery. Then someone is playing a dangerous game. Were you and Marion friends? Yes. Enemies? No. Did she blackmail you? Eleanor hesitated. Once. What did she want? Money. How much? £5,000. Were you and Marion friends? Yes. Enemies? No. Did she blackmail you? Eleanor hesitated. Once. What did she want? Money. How much? £5,000. Charles entered the room. You never told me that. I had no reason to. You had every reason. Miss Marple looked at Charles. Did you pay her? No. Did Eleanor? Yes. When? 11 years ago. And after that, she disappeared. Did you know where she went? No. Miss Marple looked at Eleanor. Did Marion know about Lydia's mother? Eleanor became pale. Charles stared. Eleanor, I didn't tell her. Tell me what? Miss Marple asked. Eleanor whispered. Lydia's mother did not die naturally. The room fell silent. Inspector Vale, who had remained near the door, stepped forward. Are you saying she was murdered? No. Then what? She killed herself. Lydia appeared in the doorway. She had heard. Miss Marple turned toward her. I'm sorry, dear. Lydia looked at Eleanor. You told me she died in hospital. She did. But you never said why. I wanted to protect you. From what? From the truth. Lydia began to cry. Charles approached her. She had been ill. You lied. We all lied. Miss Marple watched the family carefully. There it was again. Not guilt, protection. People often lied most fiercely when they believed the truth would hurt someone they loved. Miss Marple asked Eleanor one final question. Why did Marion threaten you? Eleanor looked at the floor. Because she knew the money had not been used to pay my father's debts. Charles stiffened. Then where did it go? Eleanor said nothing. Miss Marple understood. The money went to Lydia's mother. Yes. Why? To save her. From whom? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Her husband. Charles went white. You told me she had left him. She tried. And the money. Paid for her escape. But she came back. Yes. Why? She loved him. Miss Marple sighed. Love makes people do foolish things, and Marian knew. She helped arrange the escape. Then why blackmail you? Because she believed I had betrayed her. Miss Marple looked thoughtful. What happened to the money? Most of it was stolen. By whom? Eleanor looked toward Charles. He shook his head. I didn't. Miss Marple studied him. She believed him. At that moment, Lydia suddenly spoke. I know who took it. Everyone turned. Lydia's face had gone white. I saw him. Who? She looked directly at Charles. Then she shook her head. No. Miss Marple waited. Lydia whispered. I saw someone take the money. Who? The night my mother disappeared. Eleanor stood. Lydia, stop. But the girl continued. I saw Aunt Eleanor give the envelope to someone. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. To whom? Lydia stared toward the hallway. To Mrs. Bellamy. Nobody moved. The revelation seemed to drain the warmth from the room. Inspector Vale slowly turned. Mrs. Bellamy. Lydia nodded. She took the money. Miss Marple said nothing. The obvious suspect had been Charles. The mysterious blackmailer had been Marian. But now the dying judge had acquired a secret of her own. Miss Marple reached for her handbag. I think, she said quietly, we should have another conversation with Mrs. Bellamy. Before they could leave, the telephone rang. Vale answered. His face changed. It's the hospital. He listened. Then he looked at Miss Marple. Mrs. Bellamy is dead. For a moment, no one spoke. Miss Marple slowly lowered her eyes carefully. Then, she said, the person who frightened us yesterday has become considerably more desperate tonight. Outside, somewhere beyond the dark windows, a dog began barking. Then came a single sound from the road, a car accelerating away. Miss Marple walked to the window. 2 red lights vanished around the corner. She smiled sadly. They are running. Vale stared at her. Who? Miss Marple shook her head. Not yet. And for the first time, she wondered whether Mrs. Bellamy had not been the intended victim at all. Section 9. The final test. By morning, the death of Mrs. Bellamy had changed everything. Until then, Little Wexford had believed itself to be dealing with one poisoning and one frightened family. Now there were 2 victims, a missing blackmailer, an old financial secret, and a recipe card that seemed to have become more dangerous with every question asked about it. Inspector Vale arrived at Rose Cottage before breakfast. Mrs. Bellamy died from the same poison, he said. Miss Marple set down her teacup. Are you certain? The doctor is certain enough. And how was it administered? That is the difficulty. She had taken nothing except tea and a small piece of toast. At 10 o'clock, Miss Marple visited the hospital. The silence that followed seemed to settle over everyone. Mrs. Bellamy's room was empty, but her belongings had been sealed. Miss Marple examined the bedside table. A teacup stood there. Beside it lay a handkerchief, and beneath the handkerchief was a recipe card. Vale looked astonished. That wasn't there yesterday. Miss Marple lifted the cloth carefully. The card was stained brown. 2 tablespoons had been crossed out. 3 had been written beneath them. Miss Marple sighed. Someone wants us to believe this is important. Isn't it? Yes. But not for the reason they think. She examined the handwriting. It was Eleanor's, or an excellent imitation. There was one tiny difference. The letter T in tablespoons had been crossed too high. Miss Marple had noticed the same habit elsewhere, on Lydia's school notebook. She said nothing. Instead, she asked Vale to bring Charles and Eleanor to Rose Cottage. They arrived together. Lydia came with them. Miss Marple placed the card on the table. Who wrote this? Eleanor looked at it. Not me. Charles said nothing. Lydia stared at the floor. Miss Marple watched her. Lydia? I don't know. Of course. Vale stepped forward. Someone is lying. Miss Marple smiled. Everyone is lying. Charles looked angry. You think my niece killed Mrs. Bellamy? I think your niece is frightened. Of what? Of discovering that the person she trusted most may not deserve her trust. Lydia looked up sharply. Miss Marple turned toward her. Do you remember the night your mother disappeared? Yes. You saw someone take the money? Yes. You said it was Mrs. Bellamy. I thought it was. Thought. Lydia swallowed. I was 16. I was hiding on the stairs. I saw my aunt give someone an envelope. Could you see the person's face? No. Then how did you identify Mrs. Bellamy? Her coat. Miss Marple nodded. What color? Dark green. Mrs. Bellamy owned a dark green coat? Yes. Did Eleanor? Lydia hesitated. Yes. The room became still. Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. Did you own one? I did. Where is it? Gone. When? Years ago. Charles suddenly looked at Eleanor. You gave it to Marian. Eleanor said nothing. Miss Marple leaned back. Miss Marple stood. I would like everyone to remain here. She left the room. Vale followed. What are you doing? Testing something. How? By giving someone an opportunity to correct a mistake. She returned carrying a small wooden box. Inside were the old recipe cards. Miss Marple placed them on the table. Inspector, tell them that the original card has been found. But it hasn't. I know. He understood. You're lying. Temporarily. They waited. Eleanor looked confused. Charles looked suspicious. Lydia looked terrified. Miss Marple watched all three. Then she said, The original recipe contains 4 tablespoons of honey. Lydia gasped. That isn't true. Miss Marple smiled. No? You said 3. I did. Lydia's face changed. She realized her mistake. Miss Marple sat down. Thank you, my dear. Lydia covered her mouth. Charles stared at her. Lydia, I didn't poison anyone. I know. Miss Marple nodded. You changed the card. Lydia began crying. I only wanted to frighten Aunt Eleanor. Why? Because she knew. Knew what? That Mrs. Bellamy had been blackmailing her. Did you know about the poison? No. Then who supplied it? Lydia looked toward Eleanor. Eleanor whispered, Marian. Everyone turned. Marian sent it? She sent a small bottle to Lydia. Lydia shook her head. I never used it. Miss Marple looked at her. Where is it? Gone. Who took it? Silence. Then Charles spoke. I did. Eleanor stared at him. Why? To protect Lydia. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. There it was, the oldest weakness in the world. People who believed they could protect one another by hiding the truth. But there was still one question. Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. Who killed Mrs. Bellamy? Eleanor's lips trembled. I don't know. Miss Marple smiled. Yes, you do. No. You gave Mrs. Bellamy the money 11 years ago. Yes. You knew she had kept evidence. Yes. You knew Marian had returned. Yes. And yesterday, when I told everyone the recipe contained 4 tablespoons, you looked at Lydia. Eleanor stared at her. I didn't. You did. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Because you knew Lydia had changed the card. Lydia looked at Eleanor. Aunt? Eleanor's composure broke. I didn't mean for anyone to die. Miss Marple nodded. That is not the same as saying you did not cause a death. Vale stepped forward. Mrs. Vane? Eleanor sank into the chair. I put the poison on the card. Lydia gasped. But you said it was tea. I lied. Why? To frighten Mrs. Bellamy into returning the evidence. But she died. I didn't know she would touch it. Miss Marple looked down. Mrs. Bellamy had not been killed by the cake. She had not been killed by Charles. She had died because Eleanor, desperate to silence an old secret, had turned a recipe card into a threat. And yet Miss Marple knew there was still one final detail. The poison had been stronger than Eleanor admitted. Someone had altered it. Someone who knew exactly how much would kill. She looked toward the door. Marian Bell stood there, and she was smiling. Section 10. The recipe card. Marian Bell stood in the doorway as quietly as though she had merely arrived for afternoon tea. She was older than the woman in the photograph, of course. Her dark hair had turned almost entirely silver, and a deep line ran between her brows. Yet there was no mistaking her. Inspector Vale stared. You're Marian Bell? Yes. You've been in Little Wexford? For several weeks. Where have you been staying? Above the old bakery. Charles stepped forward. You're alive. Marian smiled. I have never found death particularly convenient. Miss Marple looked at her. And you have been watching us? Yes. Why? Because Eleanor Vane has spent 11 years pretending that she alone carried the burden of the past. Eleanor rose unsteadily. You threatened me. I warned you. You sent the poison. Marian's expression hardened. I sent you a bottle of harmless bittering powder. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Not poison. No. Something designed to make the recipe card smell unpleasant. I wanted you frightened enough to tell the truth. Eleanor stared at her. But Mrs. Bellamy died. I know. Then someone changed what you sent. Marian nodded. Someone added the poison. Inspector Vale looked toward Lydia. The young woman shook her head violently. Not me. No, said Miss Marple. Not Lydia. Everyone turned. Miss Marple walked to the table and touched the old recipe card. The answer was on this card from the beginning. Vale frowned. How? The stain was never the important thing. The handwriting was. She pointed toward the altered line. Eleanor writes the letter too high. Lydia writes it low. Charles writes it almost horizontally. Marian writes it with a slight backward stroke. Marian smiled. And who wrote the dangerous addition? Miss Marple looked at her. You did. Marian's smile vanished. I did not. You wrote the message, but you did not expect anyone to die. The poison was added afterward. By whom? Miss Marple turned toward Eleanor. By you. Eleanor closed her eyes. No. You knew Marian had sent the harmless powder. You replaced it with poison, intending to make Mrs. Bellamy believe Marian was responsible. Marian stared at Eleanor. You wicked woman. I was desperate. You killed her. I didn't know she would touch the card, but you knew she would. Miss Marple spoke softly. That is the important distinction. Eleanor looked at her. How? Because Mrs. Bellamy had already told you that she smelled the card. You knew she was curious about it. You knew she would examine anything connected with the recipe. Vale stepped closer. Then why kill her? Miss Marple looked at Eleanor. Because Mrs. Bellamy possessed the final piece of evidence. What evidence? Marian reached into her coat and produced a small notebook. This. Eleanor stared. No. Yes, Marian said. Mrs. Bellamy kept it. Miss Marple opened the notebook. Inside were payments made 11 years earlier. Names, dates, amounts, and one final entry. Eleanor Vane, £5,000. Beside it was another name, Marian Bell. Charles read the page. She paid you. Marian nodded. To help Lydia's mother escape. Why did you betray her? I didn't. Miss Marple looked up. She did. Everyone stared at Eleanor. Miss Marple continued. Eleanor paid Marian to arrange the escape, but when Lydia's mother returned, Eleanor panicked. She wanted the matter buried. She allowed everyone to believe Charles had stolen the money. Charles looked stunned. You knew? No, Eleanor whispered. You knew enough, Miss Marple said. You took the blame because you believed protecting Lydia mattered more than clearing your name. Charles looked away. Marian's voice softened. Lydia's mother came back because she believed her husband had changed. He had not. What happened? Lydia asked. Marian looked at her. She died because she trusted him. Lydia began to cry. Miss Marple placed the ledger down. And Mrs. Bellamy knew all of this. Yes, Marian said. She blackmailed Eleanor. Yes, and Eleanor decided to frighten her. Yes, but someone else decided to kill her. Marian nodded. Miss Marple looked toward Charles. Not you. Then Lydia. Not you. Then Marian. Not you. Finally, Eleanor. You prepared the poisoned card. Eleanor bowed her head. I only wanted silence. And silence, Miss Marple said gently, is sometimes more dangerous than a lie. Inspector Vale took Eleanor's arm. She did not resist. As he led her away, Lydia remained beside the window. Charles approached her. I am sorry. She shook her head. You should have told me. Yes. So should Aunt Eleanor. Yes. Miss Marple gathered the recipe cards. People often believe secrets protect families, she said. Usually they merely give secrets time to grow. Outside, Little Wexford was beginning its ordinary afternoon. Children passed the garden gates. A bicycle bell rang. The village would talk for weeks. There would be arguments about who had suspected Eleanor first, who had known Marian was alive, and whether Mrs. Bellamy had deserved what happened to her. Miss Marple knew that last question was useless. No one deserved to die because of another person's fear. That evening, she returned to Rose Cottage and made herself a cup of tea. On the table lay the harmless recipe card from the old bakery. 3 tablespoons of honey. She smiled. The smallest difference had nearly been overlooked, yet people were much like recipes, she thought. Change one ingredient, and the whole character could alter. A little fear, a little pride, a little jealousy, and, sometimes, one secret too many. She folded the card and placed it inside her knitting basket. Then she heard the church clock strike 7. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Little Wexford was peaceful again. Almost. She knew better. Villages were never truly peaceful. They merely became quiet between their secrets. And somewhere, in another kitchen, another recipe was probably being written. Miss Marple smiled. She hoped it would contain nothing more dangerous than too much honey. Then she picked up her knitting and began another row, while the evening settled gently over the village and the last traces of the mystery disappeared into the ordinary sounds of life. Section 11. 3 tablespoons. The morning after Eleanor Vane was taken away, Little Wexford woke beneath a pale sky. There was no rain, no wind, and nothing in the appearance of the village to suggest that 2 women had died. An old scandal had returned, and a family secret had finally been dragged into daylight. Yet people moved differently. Miss Marple noticed these things while walking to the village green. At 10 o'clock, Inspector Vale came to Rose Cottage. "I have something for you." He placed a small envelope on the table. Miss Marple looked at it. "From Eleanor?" "Yes." She opened it. Inside was a single recipe card. 3 tablespoons of honey. Nothing else had been written upon it. Miss Marple turned it over. On the back was a message. "I am sorry." She read it twice. Then she folded the card. Did she confess everything? Enough. And Marian. She has agreed to testify. Charles. He has been cleared. And Lydia. Staying with relatives for a while. Miss Marple nodded. That may be wise. Vale sat down. "I still don't understand one thing." "What?" "Why did Eleanor think she could get away with it?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. Because she had spent 11 years getting away with something much larger. The money? The lie. Vale considered this. She convinced everyone Charles was guilty. Yes. Even herself? Especially herself. The inspector frowned. How can someone convince themselves of something they know is false? Quite easily. Miss Marple looked toward the window. People do it whenever the truth becomes inconvenient. "Bellamy's death still troubles me," Vale said. "It should. She was not an innocent woman. No. She blackmailed Eleanor. Yes. She helped hide the truth. Yes. Yet she didn't deserve to die. No." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "That is the difficulty with justice. It cannot be measured by how unpleasant a person was." Vale nodded. "Did you know Eleanor was responsible before Marian appeared?" Miss Marple smiled. "I suspected." "When?" "When Lydia corrected me." "About the 4 tablespoons?" "Yes." "But why was that important?" "Because Lydia knew the recipe contained 3. I had deliberately told her 4. Vale looked puzzled. "You tricked her." "Only slightly." "And when she corrected you?" "I knew she had seen the original. But that didn't prove she was guilty." "No." "What did it prove?" "That someone had shown her the recipe. And that someone trusted her." Vale smiled. "You make it sound simple." "Most things are simple after they are understood." He stood. "I'll see you at the fete next year." "I hope not." "Why?" "Because if there is another murder, I shall have to stay longer." Vale laughed. When he had gone, Miss Marple returned to her chair. Then there was a knock. Lydia entered. "I wanted to say goodbye." "Are you leaving?" "Tomorrow." "I think that is sensible." Lydia sat opposite her. "I keep thinking about my aunt." "That is natural. I loved her. I know. Even after everything?" Miss Marple smiled. Love does not disappear simply because someone disappoints us. Lydia looked down. Do you think she is evil? No. Then what is she? Human. Lydia gave a small, sad laugh. That sounds worse. Sometimes it is. After a moment, Lydia asked, Why did you keep helping us? Miss Marple looked genuinely puzzled. Because you needed help. That is all? That is usually enough. Lydia stood. At the door she stopped. Miss Marple? Yes? Did you ever think I might have killed Mrs. Bellamy? Miss Marple smiled. For approximately 30 seconds. Lydia stared. Why? Because frightened people can do extraordinary things. Then how did you know I hadn't? I didn't. You didn't? No. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I simply knew you had not planned it. Lydia looked relieved. What's the difference? A great deal. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the old bakery. The door had been repaired. Inside, the shelves were empty. Marian Bell was packing a suitcase upstairs. I wanted to see the place. Marian nodded. It will be sold. Miss Marple looked around. Memories are not always the problem. What is? What people do with them. Before leaving, she noticed something on the counter. A recipe card. Marian followed her gaze. That was there when I arrived. Miss Marple picked it up. The writing was faded. There were no stains, no secret marks, no hidden message, only a simple list of ingredients. Flour, butter, honey, lemon. Miss Marple smiled. 3 tablespoons. Marian nodded. Always 3. Miss Marple placed the card back. Then she walked home. Outside, the evening light turned the village windows gold. Miss Marple thought of Eleanor, Charles, Lydia, Marian, and Mrs. Bellamy. 5 people connected by one old recipe. 5 lives altered by secrets that had survived for 11 years. It reminded her of a garden. A garden could look perfectly orderly from a distance, but beneath the flowers, roots twisted around one another. Sometimes they nourished each other. Sometimes they strangled. And sometimes, if left alone long enough, they became impossible to separate. Miss Marple took one final sip of tea. Then she smiled. The mystery of the stained recipe card was finished. But human nature, she knew, never was. For Miss Marple, however, the ending was never entirely an ending. A mystery might be solved, a culprit named, and a village reassured. But the habits that created the trouble remained. Pride would return, fear would return, jealousy would return. Only the names would change, and perhaps that was the saddest truth of all. And that was why villages would always have secrets, why people would always lie, why someone would always believe that one small deception could cause no harm, and why, somewhere, sooner or later, an apparently ordinary day would become extraordinary again. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. She had another row to finish. For the moment, that was enough. Section 12, the last piece. 3 days later, Little Wexford held another gathering. It was not a fete. There were no cakes arranged beneath bright ribbons, no judges, no brass instruments, and certainly no recipe cards displayed on polished tables. It was afternoon tea at the vicarage. Reverend Hawthorne had suggested it because, as he put it, the village needed something ordinary to talk about. Miss Marple thought this was optimistic. Ordinary conversation in Little Wexford had never been particularly ordinary. Mrs. Finch was the first to arrive. She brought a lemon cake and immediately explained that she had never trusted Eleanor Vane. This was not true. Miss Marple remembered Mrs. Finch praising Eleanor's honey cake only a week earlier. But she said nothing. People liked to rewrite their memories after events had happened. It made them feel wiser than they had been. Inspector Vale arrived next. He looked tired. The papers have gone, he told Miss Marple. To the magistrate? Yes, and Eleanor. She has admitted the poisoning. All of it. Enough for a conviction. Miss Marple nodded. And Marian? She is leaving tomorrow. Good. Vale hesitated. There is something I still cannot explain. Miss Marple smiled. There always is. Why did Eleanor poison the card rather than the cake? Because she wanted Mrs. Bellamy to believe Marian was responsible. But she knew Mrs. Bellamy might die. She told herself she didn't. Vale frowned. That seems impossible. People are remarkably inventive when excusing themselves. He sat down. Then there was Lydia's altered card. Yes, she changed 2 tablespoons to 3. No, Eleanor changed 3 to 2. Vale blinked. Then what did Lydia change? Nothing. But she admitted that she had seen the original card. She was frightened and wanted to protect Eleanor. Vale stared. I thought Lydia had altered it. That was the purpose of her lie. Miss Marple lifted her teacup. By blackmail. Yes. It becomes difficult to tell who was protecting whom. Exactly. The vicar entered carrying a fresh pot of tea. For a few minutes, everyone discussed the weather. It was peaceful. Then Mrs. Finch said, I suppose we shall never know the whole truth. Miss Marple looked at her. Oh, I think we know enough. But there must have been more. There always is. Mrs. Finch leaned forward. Then tell us. Miss Marple smiled. She had no intention of satisfying the village's appetite for secrets. Instead, she said, the important thing is not what people hide. It is why they hide it. Mrs. Finch looked disappointed. Inspector Vale looked amused. Miss Marple continued. Eleanor feared disgrace. Charles feared losing Lydia. Lydia feared losing Eleanor. Marian feared that the truth about Lydia's mother would remain buried. Mrs. Bellamy feared losing the money she received for keeping silent. And the recipe. The recipe was simply convenient. Convenient? Yes. Miss Marple looked toward the window. Reverend Hawthorne smiled. Perhaps we should stop serving honey cake. Certainly not. Everyone laughed. For the first time in days, the laughter sounded natural. Later, Miss Marple walked home alone. The village seemed almost unchanged. The postman was making his rounds. A child was chasing a red ball. 2 gardeners argued about roses. A cat slept on a windowsill. Miss Marple paused beside the churchyard. She looked at the old gravestones. Human beings had always been much the same, she thought. They wanted love. They wanted security. They wanted to be admired. And, above all, they wanted their own version of the past to be true. That was where trouble began. At Rose Cottage, a parcel waited on the doorstep. Miss Marple picked it up. There was no name. Inside was a small tin. She opened it. A dozen freshly baked honey biscuits lay inside. Beneath them was a card. 3 tablespoons. Miss Marple laughed softly. There was another line underneath. For your kindness. She recognized the handwriting. Lydia. Miss Marple carried the tin inside. She made tea. Then she sat beside the window and ate 1 biscuit. It was slightly too sweet. She smiled. 3 tablespoons, she murmured. The phrase had become a symbol now. 3 tablespoons of honey had represented a family recipe. Then it had become a secret code. Then a threat. Then a false clue. And finally, something almost ordinary again. Perhaps that was the best ending a mystery could have. Not justice alone. Not punishment alone, but the return of ordinary things, a village recovering its breath, a young woman beginning again, a man freed from an old accusation, a woman forced to face the consequences of her choices, and an old bakery waiting to be sold, its secrets finally quiet. Miss Marple finished her tea. Outside, the church bells struck 6. She looked toward the road. For a moment she imagined she saw Eleanor's figure disappearing beyond the hedge. Then she blinked. There was nobody there. Only the evening. Only the village. Only life continuing. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, a hand that trembled. A question answered too quickly. A memory altered slightly. A recipe changed by 1 tablespoon. Small things. Always small things. And perhaps that was why people overlooked them. They expected danger to announce itself. It seldom did. Sometimes danger arrived quietly, carrying a cake. Sometimes it arrived disguised as kindness. Sometimes it sat at a tea table and smiled. But sooner or later, if one watched carefully enough, the truth emerged. Miss Marple smiled and began another row of knitting. The mystery was finished. The village would talk about it for years. Eventually, however, even the story would fade. The names would become less important. The details would blur. But somewhere in Little Wexford, Whenever someone measured honey into a bowl, there would be a pause. 3 tablespoons, no more, no less, and perhaps that was fitting, for the smallest alteration had changed everything. Miss Marple looked out at the peaceful village. Then she closed the curtains. The evening settled gently around Rose Cottage. There was no thunder, no ominous music, no final scream. Miss Marple smiled. For once, everything was exactly as it should be.